Hello, this is John Majori with MajoriOnBowie.com. And this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a new interview every week that has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog, www.majorionbowie.com, where I have new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. Today, I have a very special guest who I'm very much looking forward to speaking with, Professor Alex Sharpe. Professor Sharpe is a professor of law at the University of Warwick in England. She's the author of over 100 publications, including books, monographs, articles, and lectures in the areas of social and legal theory, law, ethics, aesthetics, legal history, criminal justice, gender, sexuality and law, and popular culture. I first became aware of Professor Sharpe when I saw a reference to a lecture that she was going to give about David Bowie that I very much wanted to attend, but she's in the United Kingdom. I'm in the United States. It's not easy for me to get there, so I couldn't see the lecture. But I was delighted to find the book that she authored, David Bowie, Outlaw, which I read, and it's fantastic, a fantastic and really compelling series of essays. And that's going to primarily be what we're going to be talking about today. So I've got the book cover up on the screen so everybody could see it. But as I introduce Professor Sharpe, I'm going to take it down. Thank you, Professor Sharpe. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, I'm very pleased to be on your show, on your podcast. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. The book is called David Bowie, Outlaw. And how do you understand Bowie as an outlaw? And how does that concept connect to the broader themes of the book?
Okay, so let me just say to begin with, I'm not using the word outlaw to mean sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that kind of outlaw, which makes us perhaps think of that really beautiful image of Bowie in Rochester in '76. You know, obviously that's one kind of outlaw.
Yeah.
But the kind of outlaw, I guess, that I'm sort of more interested in is not breaking the law in the sense of being caught for a drug offense, but more in the sense of undermining law and the normative order, if you like, as a sort of categorical system, if you like. So it's more about mixing or defying or playing with genre in different ways, whether that's musical genres or artistic genres, or whether that's gender or sexuality, or in all kinds of different ways. Bowie plays with categories, I think, whether that's human and animal or male and female, or, you know, in lots of different ways he kind of does that. So the way in which we understand the world is we do that through categories, right? We have a kind of picture in our head of the way things are. And he tends to push against that, if you like, the self-evident, the axiomatic, the common sense of things is very much really, I think, what Bowie's, well, one of the things anyway that he's pushing against and also kind of playing with artistically. So I kind of explored that, I guess. So I'm not using law in the sense of a statute.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of law much more kind of philosophically as rules, norms, rules by which we live our lives and make sense of the world.
Yeah, I'll tell you, a reaction I had in reading the book is that I found my understanding of words to be challenged, which I think was by design. And, you know, we were just talking about your use of the term outlaw, and the next term that really sort of challenged us to think about is monster. You draw on, philosophical and social theorist thinking to really contemplate the meaning of that word, and you applied it to Bowie. So how did you apply it to Bowie in his work, monster?
Okay, so it needs quite a bit of unpacking to talk about the monster. So the first thing we can say a few things about it initially. So first of all, it was a legal category, right? Goes back to Roman law, which I know you have a particular interest in. So it goes back at least to Roman law, probably even further. It entered the legal codes of Europe in the Middle Ages, and it really was a legal category for 500 years, both in the UK and in the States. I think in the States, even into the 20th century, the monster category was on your was law, right? So that's kind of interesting in its own right. But I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in the idea of the monster as a kind of template within social theory and philosophy. So if we think about difference or outsiders, groups that are seen as different or thought of as outsiders and are treated as outsiders, often in negative ways throughout history, there are lots of ways of thinking about that, lots of terms like, stranger, scapegoat, alien. So monster is like a category of that kind. And it's a particularly useful one, I think. So there's lots of thinking about that category. So we've got lots of different categories and we can choose monster. But if we focus on monster, there are lots of different ways of thinking about that category. So for example, if we take psychoanalysis, which I'm not particularly exploring through that, but if we think about the monster in psychoanalytical terms, we would say we're all monsters, right? Because we're all kind of split and we spend the rest of our lives trying to put ourselves back together. And that's kind of true, I think, but it only takes us so far because it doesn't really explain why some people, like Jewish people or queer people, have been monsterized fairly regularly through time, right? If we're all monsters, then it doesn't really tell us this, it doesn't really shine much light on this other thing about monsters.
If we're all monsters, none of us are monsters.
Well, some of us seem to be more regularly monsterized, right? So that's what I'm saying. So other theories try to shine some light on that. So examples include Georges Canguilhem and Michel Foucault, who are two French historians and philosophers that I draw on. I'll leave Canguilhem to one side and just talk about Foucault. I guess listeners are probably more familiar with Foucault because he's a kind of bit of a superstar that has entered the popular culture a little bit as well. Well, he has. So for him, the monster is really the way we should think about a monster is not just as a kind of scary creature that's coming for us, which horror movies encourage us to think of it in that way, but to think of it as involving a kind of double breach. So if a society, say hundreds of years ago or whenever, thinks of a particular person or a group as monsters, they do so, as far as Foucault's concerned, for two reasons. One, because they see the body of that person as monstrous. That usually means it's excessive in some way. Obvious example being perhaps a conjoined twin, or alternatively, it's a monstrosity. Sorry, it's a monstrosity because of that physical excess, or because of something psychologically excessive. So we might think here about queer sexuality or something like that. So there's a monstrosity, a breach of nature, which is either explained through the physical body being somewhat excessive, or something abnormal, in brackets, going on internally in this psychological sense. But that only means that we have a monstrosity in Foucault, and I'm using his terms here, these are not my opinions. If we have a monstrosity, that doesn't mean we have a monster, because it just means we have a breach of nature. What Foucault is saying is that in order for a monster to become legible or recognized as a monster, we also need this very same figure, this body or psychology, to confront and to overturn law itself as a categorical system. So if we take an example like the conjoined twin, I mean, there are lots of examples, but this is perhaps an easy one to work with. Obviously, we don't view conjoined twins this way today, but historically, we might say the conjoined twin might have been seen as a monstrosity, because you've basically got, I mean, it's a complex philosophical problem about how we think about conjoined twins. Is it two people, or is it one person? It's one body and two people is the way we normally think about it, but we don't necessarily have to think about it. In some ways, that's to impose other kinds of ideas on the phenomenon of conjoinment. But putting that to one side, we might say that we have a monstrosity because we've got two minds in one body, right? Which is a problem for legal thinking and the social order, in terms of we normally think of each person having one mind and one body, right? We are singular, yeah. So we have that issue, but it's also, and perhaps more importantly, a breach of law, because the whole of law and legal order is constructed around the idea of having one body and one mind. So that assumption is questioned, challenged, brought to crises almost if we push the envelope. So what he's really saying is that we have a body or a psychology that is seen as a monstrosity, shocking in some way, but at the same time, it undermines or challenges or problematizes the legal order in some way and makes it leaky or porous or problematic. And so it's that kind of threat that there's then a response to that threat, if you like, through calling, someone a monster and then regulating them in some way. So that was probably a little bit convoluted, but these are quite complicated ideas that we're talking about. So hopefully they're making them a bit more transparent.
Well, I think so. And I was thinking about, like, in the essay where this topic is discussed, you devote some amount of space to what you were just talking about and explaining the concept, because in order to apply the concept to Bowie, I think that your readers, or in this case, the audience, needs to arrive at a common understanding of what the term means. And I'll just, as you're talking about this, I thought that there was a point you made that's it just stuck with me when I read it, where you were saying, so in that respect, the Hulk is a monster, but Godzilla is not.
Yeah, because, well, that's a specific point I'm making there. So we can think of monsters are hybrids fundamentally. So we could. And
I don't mean to interrupt you, but the reason I mentioned that is it's like, what does this have to do with David Bowie? And Bowie, right? Bowie often plays with hybridity, right? If that's a word, and ambiguity, and whether it's through gender fluidity, or he has creatures that are part animal and part human, or part ape men with metal parts. And I was thinking, even this morning about he evokes transition in even his lyrics, station to station, or changes, or in TVC 15 transmission transition. And I think your devotion of time and space and explanation to this concept is to set up the application to Bowie, right?
Yeah, and so in this particular essay, I'm certainly trying to link. Well, I suppose I'm trying to express these ideas through Bowie. So whereas a lot of people who write about Bowie are kind of interested in Bowie, I mean, I'm interested in Bowie. We're all tasteful fans of the man, but a lot of the literature is about him and what he has to say about popular culture, which is really fascinating. And we both read the author books as well. But in my book, what I'm trying to do is say something about philosophical ideas or contemporary debates in art, and so forth, and using Bowie as a kind of conduit to do it, to bring it to life, which in itself tells us quite a lot about Bowie, because the fact that he so readily can be used for these purposes tells us quite a lot about the depth of his work in itself, right? Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk. I mean, if we talk about hybridity, there are lots of different kinds of hybridity. You've mentioned human-animal hybridity, which is kind of like one of the more obvious and more graphic kinds. And Bowie certainly touches upon that in all kinds of ways. I mean, obvious examples. I mean, the first example I can think of is that photo shoot that was done of the Egyptian Sphinx in 71, right?
Yeah.
The Ward photo shoot. Then we've got obviously the Diamond Dogs album cover, which every fan will know. But also we can think of the Minotaur and Outside, and it just goes on and on. And this is just in relation to human-animal hybridity, rather than other forms of shape-shifting or genre-defying strategies or playfulness around these categories. But there's another really important thing I just should mention about monsters, because it's not just about, I mean, for Foucault, the question is, how do monsters come into the world and how do they fade away?
Yeah.
They come into the world when bodies or psychologies are understood in this way. And when we stop understanding them in that way, and we might say that happens because science kills monsters, right? Because we no longer believe in them, right? Because science has explained them in some other way, they kind of fade away. But there's another really important aspect philosophically to the chapter or the essay on monsters, which is really relevant to Bowie. And that's where I draw on Jacques Derrida rather than Foucault. Because one of the key points Derrida makes about monsters is that monsters guarantee us a future. And I think this is a really important point. And I think Bowie does this, right, artistically. So what we need to do here is to distinguish between the idea of a future. Remember, Bowie says, I want a better future, right, in the song. We need to distinguish between the word future and the word tomorrow. They're not the same thing, right? So tomorrow is just time to come. And then tomorrow, and again, to quote Bowie, the next day. It's just a day after day after day of tomorrows. It's just time. But a future is not just that, right? A future is time plus something. And what that something is novelty or surprise. It's what makes tomorrow worth living, worth anticipating, worth hanging around for and not topping ourselves. Yeah. If life was just endless tomorrows, we might as well just pack up. We all hope that tomorrow will be a future, and a future means time to come that will be surprising. And of course, Bowie was always surprising and enchanting. Yeah. So this is another thing. And monsters are that, right? Because monsters, precisely because they challenge categories and they create through mixing. Rather than just the same, they play with the cultural, or Bowie did. He played with the cultural forms, musical forms and other cultural forms, and put them together in new ways, in tasteful ways that were surprising and interesting, kept us interested.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so monsters do that by definition, because whatever the categories are, monsters play with them, they break them, they show that they're porous.
Right.
But Bowie said something, didn't he? Something along the lines of, when anything becomes kind of static, it loses all its potency.
Yeah.
Once it becomes fixed. We again captures this sort of idea.
Yeah, I'm thinking how you're taking David Bowie's music, David Bowie's art, and using it as a launching pad to discuss these ideas, which are profound and might be less accessible without that point of commonality, which is Bowie and his music. And it's the more you talk about this, the more just what's happening in my own head right now as I'm talking to you and when I was reading your book, is I'm thinking about how what you're describing applies to the art. And it makes it so much, these are complex ideas, but it makes it so much more accessible. And it also makes me think about how, Bowie encouraged his audience to engage with his art with a type of subjectivity. He rarely told us what to think of his own songs. he encouraged to bring our interpretation. And can you elaborate on how his openness to audience interpretation, to apply our own meaning to what he gave us to work with, fits into your broader theories about his work and the utility of his work?
Yeah, and so okay, to begin with, Bowie described himself as a kind of, or has been described as a postmodern rock star, and he certainly described himself, him and Eno, as kind of establishing a school of pretensions and so on. And in lots of ways, Bowie is quite postmodern, but I think actually he's kind of not in a lot of other ways, and he's kind of romantic in some ways, and he's quite existentialist in some quite fundamental ways. But in terms of answering your question, though, about openness and interpretation, of course, language is always open in some sense, because the very nature of language is that it can't be tied down. And however, as a lawyer, I know this, right? No matter if you have a contract where you try to think of every possibility that might happen in the future to protect your client, you try to anticipate that and then have a clause about it so you know what to do if that should happen. There's always something that's going to happen in the future that you never thought of, right? So it's impossible, or indeed the language you use, like reasonableness or proportionality, well, it's like a piece of string a little bit, isn't it? There's always going to be argument around what that means in a particular context. So language is just intrinsically, to some degree or other, open, and then people can, lawyers can play. I always tell my students that you kind of live in that space of the indeterminacy of language, right? And for Bowie, that's kind of true too, but he gave permission, as you said. He he kind of comes from an art background, doesn't he? I think to understand Bowie, really, we need to recognize that fundamentally he's kind of an artist, and he sees the world as an artist rather than a musician in some ways, I think. So he gets all those points. Like, he liked to cite Marcel Duchamp a lot, didn't he? You know, so Duchamp, who's famous for the toilet that he stuck in the museum back in the day. Shock French society. But the point is, you know, Duchamp is really saying that the art, what does it mean? Well, we don't know that until the viewer arrives, right? Until that point, there is no art in a way. And Bowie kind of really got that quite young, I think, and applied that to pretty much everything he did. So he deliberately creates incredibly open textured work. I think in the beginning, before he encountered Burroughs, I think he did that through dreams, because he was a bit of a REM machine. You know, he seemed to have very deep and colorful dreams that he used to write. But then increasingly he used Burroughs. Well, it's not Burroughs cut-ups technique, it's a technique that goes way back to Dada and further. But Burroughs popularized it, and Bowie kind of came to learn of it, I think, through Burroughs. And he used it, didn't he, on the Diamond Dogs album, and then pretty much throughout, you know, going forward. And that's not the only way in which we open things up, but that it opens the writing up quite dramatically as to, you know, what does it mean? And, you know, it means whatever you think it means. And Bowie didn't really care what it meant, because it's like someone would say to him, this song's really awful, you know, who wrote it? And he would say, a computer. Of an Eno influence.
Yeah.
So I think it's almost like a kind of postmodern sort of sensibility, in the sense that he kind of gives up ownership or propriety in meaning.
Right.
You know, with some rock stars, it's kind of like, this is what the song means, and it's about my life, and, you know, this girl left me, or something, you know, I lost my job, and this is what the story's all about. And Bowie doesn't really write like that on the whole. I mean, you might find the exception, like Hermione or something like that, where it's supposedly a song about a breakup when he was young, but he generally doesn't really write in that way. So it does open up that space, and then I think we can become active agents then in that space, as you suggested, rather than kind of being dictated to. We're not passive. He doesn't really encourage a kind of passive audience. It's quite the opposite.
Yeah,
he wants people to interpret.
I've noticed, you know, in reading interviews with Bowie over years, that's the one constant when he's asked about what his music is about or what a song is about. Is he the one constant throughout, you know, the arc of his career, is he's giving the meaning to us. But it's sort of funny to see how that's the constant when you read contradictory statements about, you know, from him. You know, within months, he'll give an interview where he says, "Young Americans is the real me," and then he says it was, you know, a couple months later he says it's awful, it's unlistenable, it's but the constant is not what he's saying about his own work. The constant is he's, you know, I'm giving it to you to interpret. So
yeah. No, in a way, I don't think it matters what, you know. Obviously, we're kind of really interested to know, well, what did Bowie think about this? And what was he trying to do? Obviously, we're interested in that. But in a way, artistically, it doesn't really matter. The artist is dead. I mean, the true artist is entirely anonymous. in that sense. Because it's how it lands, isn't it? It's how it lands. What sense we make of it, and we could all make different sense of it. And people interpret Bowie songs in all kinds of different ways, and that's completely fine and entirely Bowie-esque, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If we were all interpreting it the same way, we'd all be making a massive mistake. And if I was trying to use Bowie to establish a consensus, he would be the wrong vehicle completely. He'd be like the worst possible person to choose from popular culture, along with Andy Warhol or someone. You know, you'd be better off choosing somebody like, I don't know, one of the singer-songwriters of the 60s who confessed.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, this is just entering my head, and then I'm going to make a slight pivot. But you know, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about, you know, I was thinking about the album Pinups, which is an enjoyable album to listen to. But if I think about where does it rank amongst Bowie's other albums, it's not up there. But why? It's, you know, it's fun, it's pleasant to listen to, but it doesn't really give us a whole lot to do with it. Like once we hear it, there's not that much left to think about, and none of them are songs.
I think it's quite a good album. I quite like a lot of the. I mean, there's some great bands that he
Yeah.
covers, and some of his covers are better. I think not all of them, but some of them. And my favorite one is "See Emily Play."
So mine too.
Yeah, but
That's not my point. Is not that they're not well performed or they're not good to listen to. But if you think about, I mean, you mentioned in passing, you mentioned The Next Day, and that album I've been thinking about for the last 16 years since it came out, because there's just so much that's in there to work with, right?
Yeah. But I suppose he didn't write those songs, so the construction of the lyrics is entirely different, right? The way that
exactly.
Or Pink Floyd or the various bands that are covered on the album, right in different ways. But you know, he's a child of William Burroughs in a really important sense, I think, because he used him to such a degree.
So I'm going to make a slight pivot to another Bowie album or era where he was the Thin White Duke, which was one of his more provocative personas, and you know, especially as he sort of played with fascist imagery. You address this in one of your essays in your book. How do you approach the character, and more broadly, how do you see Bowie's use of morally troubling material functioning as a challenge to the audience?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, first off, just to sort of set the scene for this, I mean, this is one of the more difficult things to write about for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Bowie was, as many listeners will know, he was accused of flirting with fascism in '76 by Rock Against Racism, which you know took off in that year in the context of a concern about, you know, rising kind of fascist tendencies in the UK, and sort of National Front, kind of right-wing political grouping, we're doing better in local elections and things like that. So there were really serious concerns about this, and I think Bowie kind of got caught up in that and spent a lot of time going forward trying to distance himself from that, and so on. So I'm kind of only interested in the question in a very narrow philosophical sense, which is, pardon me, to think about, if we think about art, whether that's a novel like Lolita, which would be a good example to consider here, or piece of art, or whatever the example might be, let's just assume that it's ethically defective in some way. Then does that mean that it's lesser in aesthetic terms? And so that's the question that I'm considering, right? So we can argue about whether a piece of work is ethically defective, but if we agree that it is, does that mean that it's aesthetically weaker or poorer or of less quality? And of course, people have different views about that. So there are three broad views in philosophy of art, and I'm kind of giving a more, not a crude account, but a more simplified account. So there's moralism, autonomism. Don't worry about that term. It's a bit off-putting, and immoralism. So moralism is really a kind of view that art should, literature in particular, but art in general should sort of how should we say, improve us morally, you know, through engaging with it. It should improve us morally. And so, you know, the best art does that, according to this view. And ethical defects get in the way of being able to absorb it or engage with it. This is a view. Goes back to Kant, this sort of idea about how we value art. And so this doesn't really work for Bowie, because Bowie's too ambiguous to have a clear message that would be like a Kant would rubber stamp. So that's not going to work for Bowie. The second sort of broad sort of way of thinking about the question is to think of what philosophers call autonomism, But we don't really need that term. We could just express that as art for art's sake, which most people will be familiar with, which is championed by Oscar Wilde and T.S. Eliot. But hardly anybody champions that now, because this kind of anything goes in art is not in favor generally. Most people would draw some line somewhere. And then the third sort of position is immoralism, which sounds awful, right? Until we think about, well, what does that mean? But really, moralism, what it's really saying is that works of art, and not only are they good art despite these ethical defects, but they're actually better art because of them. Well, that's possible in some cases. So it's kind of a reversal of moralism in that sense. Yeah. So where moralism says that ethical defects mean aesthetic value is reduced, immoralism is saying the opposite, that ethical defects can actually serve a purpose to render an artwork in aesthetic terms more valuable, higher, of great quality. So that's the model, if you like, or the position within this philosophical debate that I'm drawing on to explore Bowie's artwork and to defend Bowie's artwork against some of these accusations. So
when Bowie's toying with these images, the Thin White Duke, that have sort of fascist connotations, and he made some public statements that drew that connection. I think, just for me, I think a difference between what he was doing and recognizing some aesthetic value to something like the Nazi movie Triumph of the Will, or the D.W. Griffith movie Birth of a Nation, which, on its sort of technical achievement is admirable, but the message itself was, in terms of that movie, it was pro-Klan, or Triumph of the Will was made to celebrate the Nazis. I don't think that's what Bowie was doing. Either his intention, or if you really contemplate the work on its own terms, like what we were just talking about, devoid from the artist's intention. If you really contemplate it, I think it's hard to draw a pro-fascist message from the body of his work. So there's a difference there, right?
Yeah. And so if we first of all, if we think about the artwork, I mean, depending on what the artwork is, I mean, some of them are simple, like a Dickens novel or a Picasso painting.
Yeah.
But with Bowie, the artwork here is the Station to Station album, the tour, the stagecraft, the lighting, the Thin White Duke character.
Yeah.
That he said. I mean, all of this can be seen as the artwork which is being evaluated, right? So it needs to be seen in toto, I think.
Yeah.
So to respond to some of the specific comments that you've made, first of all, I agree. I don't think Bowie is a fascist or has fascist sympathies or leanings. I see it as, I think if we go back a step, I think where this comes from is before 1976. We can go back much earlier. So to Ziggy and possibly earlier, I think Bowie had a real interest in this relationship between fan and star.
Yeah.
You might say between leader and followers.
Yeah.
Which is obviously of interest within politics and political philosophy, about how people give themselves over to power, right? Which Bowie had, which is kind of happening all around us right at the moment. Yeah. It's very real, makes it timely. But Bowie said that when he was Ziggy, he remembered at times feeling that the fans were so enamored that he felt they would basically do anything that he said, and he said it was really scary.
Yeah.
So that kind of rally, and I think the Station to Station tour in some ways was likened to a kind of Nuremberg rally by all kinds of journalists who remembered Nuremberg because they were old enough and attended the Outlaw tour one. So he's clearly kind of playing with some of these themes. I mean, there is breadth there, and there's German expressionism, and of course, Bowie will always mingle different elements together, and we've got European electronic music and Black American funk, and there's all kinds of different things sitting together in a complex kind of configuration. But in terms of the question that we're thinking about, I think there's clearly an exploration of this idea of what the relationship is between star and fan, leader and followers, how people give up. I mean, we might think of Eric Fromm here, you know, the idea that people give up freedom. You know, nobody wants freedom. They think they do. Bowie says that, right? You know, they never choose Nietzsche. They always choose Hitler, right? in those kinds of situations, because freedom is terrifying, right? It comes with an enormous amount of responsibility, which most people don't want, right? Which is a kind of Fromm view. I think Bowie had kind of concerns of that kind too. What about that? So I see the whole artwork as a kind of exploration of this psychological dynamic between fans and stars, leaders and followers, and it's really about a love of power, which is kind of fascism. And it is all right, and it's about having to engage with that artistically, and fans are forced to engage with it too, right? On some level, through involvement with the artwork, because if you're involved with an artwork, you're engaging with it necessarily, right? I don't, and obviously it's problematic and this is where the ethical defects kick in, because Bowie's not really clear, right? In that way, so it's a bit more ambiguous. So that he's quite seductive. I mean, I think he said later that he tried to caricature fascism, but it's not like a Chaplin movie, is it? Where he's clearly caricaturing Hitler, right? The dictator. I think with Bowie, it's much more seductive in a way. So he's sort of showing that side of how we can be seduced, I think. But he's not encouraging us to be seduced. He's trying to get us, I think, to think for ourselves.
Yeah.
Which is why it's an immoral artwork, because in a way it requires a deeper engagement, which leads, according to immoralist philosophers, to a deeper and a sort of better kind of constitution of a moral self, because you have to go deeper and deeper with it, to think harder about it.
You know, I'm thinking about, as you're saying this, I'm thinking about some of his works before The Thin White Duke, like the song Big Brother. Big Brother doesn't actually do anything in the song. The song is about, we want you, Big Brother, right? It's about the appeal of Big Brother. Or Savior Machine, where whatever the Savior Machine is, it like pleads not to be empowered. And then once it is, its logic is to destroy the world, right? But the song is about, and there's many other examples where he's really, like you're saying, I mean, this is what I'm taking from what you're saying and connecting it to what Bowie's work actually was he's drawing our attention to our own desire to have somebody else make decisions for us, and our own desire to hand over our agency. Or, even the song, Somebody Up There Likes Me, right? Is he talking about a pop star, a dictator, a religious figure, right? But it's like the appeal is seductive, as you're saying, that we're not necessarily aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think he said somewhere that, if in doubt, you need to look at the guy in the mirror.
Yeah.
And of course, dystopias are very much a feature of a lot of Bowie's work, as you say, and the Diamond Dogs album being an obvious example. But there's lots of dystopias where Bowie, he tends to look into the future. There's a lot of science fiction and futurism in Bowie, as we all know. But with the Station to Station album, he's kind of looking back, isn't he, to an earlier period in German history.
Sure, yeah.
Rather than forward. But obviously it's still a dystopia. And I think Bowie was fascinated by totalitarianism, both in terms of communist examples and the German experience as well. I think he was quite fascinated by all of that. And for all kinds of reasons, including his interest in the occult. I mean, it's hard to pin him down in some ways because he has lots of different interests that kind of intersect with these things.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I could talk to you about this one topic all day, but I want to touch on the subject of one of the other essays in the book. And then you've been so generous with your time. Just a couple of closing questions. There's an essay that focuses on love and Bowie as a philosopher of love, but much as with some of these other terms like outlaw or monster, I think you challenge us, the reader, to really think about the meaning of the word love. And so how do you define it, the word in this context? How does the idea of letting go fit into the broader understanding of Bowie's work.
Okay, so I'm sure, as many, if not most of your readers will appreciate, that lots of different ways of thinking about love and experiencing love, right? So we can think of eros, the romantic or passionate love that we're all familiar with, or philia as a kind of friendship, that we have friendships with people, that a deep kind of love, in some ways a deeper kind of love, arguably. And then I'm interested, for the purpose of the essay, in a different kind of love, which the phrase is agape, right? Which is a kind of Greek Christian or Greco-Christian sort of idea of a universal love, right?
Yeah.
Kind of a New Testament love, perhaps we might say. I think it's that kind of love that we might read, because we're reading here, aren't we? We're reading Bowie's work and seeing what we don't all find the same things. But for me, and I don't think I'm alone. I know Simon Critchley reads Bowie in this way also. That there's a kind of yearning in Bowie's work, a strong yearning that we latch on. Not in every song, of course, but frequently, and in some of the best stuff, there's a real yearning that comes across. Sweet Thing is a great example of this. Fantastic example of this incredible yearning that you kind of latch onto and feel. And I think it is a yearning for love, as Critchley says. And I think that yearning for love and that reaching out for something bigger, sort of meta, kind of cascades through much of his work. And it's one of the reasons why I think people really connect with Bowie, even if it's not articulated in that way. You asked me about letting go, and I think, I'm suggesting that Bowie's giving love lessons, which is to say, I'm reading Bowie's work as containing these lessons. And one of the lessons is letting go. And we often don't do that, and we should. And I think Bowie conveys this lesson metaphorically and artistically through, in effect, killing off objects of fan love. It's kind of ritual suicide. He does it with Ziggy, of course. He kills Ziggy.
Yeah.
All familiar with when that happened. We all know exactly where and when that happened. And then he continued to do that with other characters, moving forward. And of course, when that happens, fans don't like that. I mean, a lot of people don't want Ziggy to die. They want Ziggy to go on, and they want 2 or 3 Ziggy albums, right? We can think of this with Dylan. If we think when Dylan stopped playing acoustic guitar and reached for the electric, people shouted Judas at him.
Yeah.
Right. People do not want you to grow, to develop, to change. But the lesson is you have to let go. You have to let go, and it's painful. It's painful, and you have to embrace the pain in a kind of Nietzschean way. Embrace it, let go, and learn to love again. And that's why being a Bowie fan is about mourning, because he's always going to go forward. He's always going to do something different. And however much you love what he's doing right now, in a way, you have to let it go. You have to let him become. And by implication, we have to let each other become, and not try to freeze other people as we would like them to be, but allow them to be what they are capable of being, and to work that out for themselves. So that really important point about love as letting go is something that I think we can find in Bowie's work, sort of metaphorically and artistically, through his strategy of constantly moving forward and killing off the very objects that fans do and have loved.
Yeah. I'll tell you, this is actually one of the reasons that I really liked your book, is you're making a point that once you explain it, seems intuitive, but I don't think that it ever occurred to me before. That, the process of him killing off his characters. It has occurred to me that more than any other artist, David Bowie gave the fans what they don't want, right? Yeah. What is this Low album? That's not what I was expecting, right? But that as a mechanism for highlighting what you just explained about letting go and the connection to that, to practicing love, experiencing love, never has occurred to me before I read your book. So thank you.
You're welcome. Very quickly, I'm talking about it in terms of, as I say, this sort of Greco-Christian idea. We might think of it more as Christianity, and Bowie was very interested in spirituality and organized religion to some extent. He had a complex relationship with those things. But Um, but we might also note that he had a massive interest in Buddhism, and this idea of letting go is very much part of that.
Yeah.
That kind of spiritual way of thinking about these broader issues.
Yeah.
Flux,
So,
a term that comes up in Bowie's work a lot.
say that again.
Flux, change.
Flux. Yes. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So we've been talking about the book, but my understanding is that you're working on, or you might be completed, might have finished it, an article that's going to come out in the journal Morality, about Bowie and morality. Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, it's not out yet. They've accepted it's subject to some changes, so I imagine it will be published, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So I've been working on I'm interested in the idea of death. I mean, we should all be interested in the idea of death. It's the biggest of themes, isn't it? Memento mori, So I think death is a really important theme that is evident in Bowie's work in all sorts of ways. In some ways, I think we might say David Bowie is a true philosopher, not in the sense that he's at NYU as a professor of philosophy and he writes philosophical texts according to like formal structure and protocols. Obviously, he's not a philosopher in that sense, but he's a philosopher in the sense of Socrates, say, because when we think about what philosophy is fundamentally, it's a meditation or a mediation on death. It's thinking about death and thinking that you're going to die, and then living your life in the face of that reality and keeping that close to you in a way. And I think David Bowie did that throughout all of his adult life, that death comes up again and again and again in all kinds of ways. So we might think of this in terms of being with death. Now, and there are lots of ways in which we can be with death. And I think there are three that stand out for me in Bowie's work and life. One is what we might describe as sort of religious transcendence, which obviously Bowie is on record as saying, he's very spiritual. He says this a lot, and it's quite obviously true. He was interested in Buddhism as a young man. He was clearly interested in Christianity and Judaism. He was also interested in a lot of occult and forms of mysticism within the sort of Judeo-Christian sort of broader tradition. So what we might say about all of this is that Bowie was a seeker, a searcher. He was always searching for a meta connection of some sort, whatever that meant. He didn't really know exactly what it meant. He didn't really buy into a lot of the formal explanations, but he felt there was something. He couldn't really let go of that. So he was kind of caught, I think, between a kind of cynicism about organized religion, but yet couldn't really let go of, I don't know, the Godhead or whatever it is. And that seems to come through in his work generally. So there's this, exists this kind of religious transcendence way of being with God, where he kind of wants to. A really good example of this is Word on a Wing on the Station to Station album, which it's really a prayer, right?
Yeah.
It's a prayer to God. I mean, it might be seen as more than that or something else as well, but it's clearly that. And there might be lots of reasons. We know Bowie was like taking a lot of cocaine, and he was, not in the best place back in that time. But still, the work is the work, and the lyrics are the lyrics. And there's clearly this kind of, he's wearing those crosses all the time, right? I see on the picture. So there's all of that. I mean, I'll move on because there's a lot one could say about the religious transcendence aspect of it. I think it's really important for him. But in terms of the other ways of being with death, the second one, and the one that kind of interests me the most, is what I would describe as existential defiance. And I really do see Bowie as really quite existential in lots of ways, although, as I said earlier, we can see him as postmodern, and we can see him as a lot of different things. These things are in tension with each other, but he clearly is existential in a lot of ways. And examples of that are, existential themes that seem to resonate for Bowie include the following. One, being in the world, being passionate about the world rather than philosophically detached from it. And that's a key existential kind of idea with Sartre and Camus and so forth. He's also buys into this idea quite strongly that we need to challenge social conventions to reveal their contingency and in the process to demonstrate our freedom. Again, very Sartre kind of idea. And perhaps most importantly, and this kind of connects us back to is nothingness. A big theme in existential philosophy in Sartre and in Martin Heidegger, right, getting us back into German fascism, given that he's had his moment with the Nazi party. But Martin Heidegger, Sartre, nothingness is a really important concept. But what does nothingness mean? It means lots of different things. It means, Bowie, as Critchley says, the word nothing appears throughout Bowie's lyrics, right? So hold on to nothing. After all, we're nothing. And nothing will help us. And we are nothing, and nothing will help us, right? That's a way of reading it. It's not that the emphasis is, for me, nothing will help us. We are nothing and it will help us, right? It's one way of reading it. So what is nothing? So there are at least three ways of thinking about that. We are nothing. That's what Bowie says, isn't it? We're nothing, right? We're nothing. Nothing will help us on Heroes. We're nothing in the sense that, we're spinning around very fast on this planet. We don't know if there's anybody else in the universe. We don't know why we're here. There's no meaning or point to any of it or purpose. We have to make our own. We don't know whether we're right. There's no criteria through which we can, make any kind of assessment of it. So we're nothing in that sense. What are we? We're nothing. We're nothing in Heidegger's sense that the nothing is internal to being, is a way that Heidegger would put it. By what he means by that is that we're conscious of death as a species. He thinks other species are not. They don't sit around thinking about their death, right? But we do. It's important for us that we know we're going to die and we dwell on it, and it's important for us. So that's an aspect of the nothing. The nothing is that sense of the present slipping away constantly, like grains of sand between your fingers. So we're nothing in that sense. And we're nothing in the sense that, Sartre's idea of existence precedes essence, the idea that we're thrown into the world without rhyme or reason. There are no rules. We don't know, there's no one to look to. There's no father figure. God is dead, etc. And we have to kind of create ourselves. So existence comes first. And the idea of essence as something solid, if that's possible, is something that we forge through time, through our interaction with the world and the choices, through the freedom we take advantage of and the choices that we make in our life. So in all of those senses, I think Bowie was quite existential, right? And then finally, acceptance, which I think is the hardest thing to do. Because even existentialists, they can intellectually kind of accept death, but to really accept it is to do it up close and personal and viscerally, which I think probably only comes later in life, which is a point Bowie makes on some of his later work. It falls on deaf ears, right? The lyric, it always falls on deaf ears. So these death themes come up a lot. Reality, the song Reality, he says, and I quote, my death is more than just a sad song. And of course, some people might not realize what that means, but for most Bowie aficionados, we all recognize that that's a double entendre, right? So his death is a reference to the song, right? The Brel song, which Bowie played in 73 and on various occasions. But it's also, my death is more than just a sad song. It's something very visceral and real, and it's heading toward me at some pace, right? So there is a kind of, So I see acceptance coming across in different songs, and we see it on, Where Are We Now in some ways, and particularly some of the later stuff. I'm already 5 years older. I'm already grave, because there's so much to draw on where he keeps making these points, right? Particularly as he gets older. But he's still interested in death when he's young, right? It's not like he it intensifies maybe, but it was never absent.
Well, something I've come to appreciate is his perspective as writing as a middle-aged man was not something I was able to really access. I'm about a generation younger than him. So when the album Hours came out, I thought it was a little bit of a disappointment. It was, it's not a great album, but now that I'm actually slightly older than he was when he made it, I find much more resonant meaning in it. And so, looking ahead to The Next Day in Black Star that he made when he was older than I am now, what you're talking about is his contemplation on death as an older man. I could recognize that it's infused with meaning from his perspective from that point in life. So I think I'm going to look forward to contemplating those albums when I get there.
Yeah, I think as we get older too, we inevitably read differently, don't we? Because all the life experience, if you listen to Bowie in your 20s, or you read a novel in your 20s,
Yeah.
or whatever, and then in your 40s, 20 years later, you've had all that life experience. So you're necessarily a different person who's reading. It's a bit like, I often give the example of, it's not possible to read Shakespeare after Freud in the way that the people at the time when Shakespeare was alive would have read Shakespeare, right? So there's always that. So getting older always, in a way, it's always fresh in that sense, because we bring different things to the viewing, listening exercise.
Yeah. There's some version of reality where Bowie is still alive and he never killed off Ziggy, and he's performing like a lounge in Las Vegas right now. And I think yeah, I mean, but anyway, we've been talking about some heavy topics, and you've been terrific, and I feel like I could talk to you all day. I won't do that to you. But I want to close on a very light and superficial topic, but it's something I ask everybody that comes on the show, which is, what's your favorite Bowie song and what's your favorite Bowie album?
Okay, so I mean, in a way, that's a bit tricky, isn't it? Because there's so much quality to choose from, and I might change my mind in the future, and I have changed my mind over time. But at the moment, I'm kind of fairly comfortable saying that my favorite album is Diamond Dogs.
Oh.
Yeah, and my favorite songs, definitely Sweet Thing on the Diamond Dogs album. I think that's an incredible song. But also, Where Are We Now, I think, is a beautiful song. It's an exquisite vulnerability to that.
Yeah.
It really moves me. A few other quick examples would be Lady Grinning Soul, Be My Wife. There you go.
Yeah. Great. And everybody, including me, says, ask me again next week and I'll give you a different answer. But so thank you, Professor Alex Sharpe. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for the book. I'm going to assume that the essay is going to be published, and I look forward to reading it when it is. And whatever else you come out with in the future on Bowie, I'm glad we made the connection. And let's stay in touch.
Very happy to do so.
Okay, thank you.